So this case study represents a customer that I worked with, and I'm going to give you some context on this customer first. So this customer was an entity that belonged to Johnson & Johnson. They were owned by Johnson & Johnson, and they were acquired by a private equity firm in Chicago for about $2.1 billion US. They had offices in 35 countries around the world, and we were engaged in a part of a kind of project or process where all of these countries and the operations and the management needed to now transfer from Johnson & Johnson to the new owners and management. So they did this in phases, and in phase 1 they moved a total of 8 countries, and these countries were not geographically concentrated. They were in all different parts of the world. So specifically we're going to look at the payroll component of this switch for these 8 countries. Now, they represented in these 8 countries 541 employees. So that was the total headcount we were dealing with for this payroll switch in these 8 countries. They had the following groups engaged to assist with the payroll process. Number 1, they had ADP, and that was their payroll provider. Then they had Deloitte Consulting, who was engaged for payroll and a number of other things involving the shift. They had Blueback Global, which is also a sort of global M&A type advisory firm, and they do quite a lot with Deloitte. And then they had Fingo HR. Fingo HR is a company that I founded that specializes in HR support in a cross-border environment and payroll services. So in this context, we didn't bring any software to the game, but rather we're acting as a support to a customer who is using a product or a service like ADP. So the way that the process flow would work, or rather let me describe Fingo's role first in the process. So we had these 8 countries. I'll just represent the countries like this. Okay, each one of those is one of the countries with the 541 headcount. And Fingo would be here in the middle, and we would work with each country to get their internal payroll data. So they would essentially get their internal changes and whatnot for their local office, put it into Excel, and get that to Fingo HR. Now, what Fingo HR would do is we would take that information and put it into what is called a flexi form. And that is a style or a format of sharing data that is required by ADP. And you kind of need to know how to do it. You have to learn how to do a flexi form. It's not just a data entry where you kind of get an Excel sheet and you can see this is the column and this is what goes into it. You need to learn how to do that. So the data's been input essentially once here, and it is input it's input a second time over here, right? So this is the first redundancy. From here, we submit that data to ADP, and ADP re-enters it for a third time into sort of the best description I have is kind of like a back-end system that is not customer facing. And so this is the second redundancy, where the same data has now been input 3 different times by 3 different parties. So inevitably, you get some form of broken telephone by the time you get here, and there are some input errors and whatnot. Now what happens is ADP will take this data and they will distribute it to 8 in-country partners. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay? And each one of these in-country partners will take the data that they receive and calculate it according to the local regulations. So in other words, what they're trying to do is get you your gross to net calculations for payroll. Now what will happen is this data needs to make its way back to these offices and the treasury teams so that payments can be dispersed. So some cases, this provider might send it back to ADP, right, over here, and then ADP will give it to this customer or this location. And this one might bypass ADP and send it straight back to the customer using Excel. And this provider might send it to the customer directly, but they use a Dropbox link. And so all the calculated data now filters back to these 8 countries at different times and in different ways. And this whole process from this point down and back typically takes you 5 to 7 days to complete. Okay. Now, in many cases, you're dealing with a pay period that is 2 weeks long or 15 days, for half of the month. So what ends up happening is, while this process is happening, we find out that employee A has resigned, and their last day is going to be the next day. We find out that we input a commission number of $3,000 for an employee who actually needed $4,000. We find out that while we actually input a number correctly here, it ended up going wrong somewhere along the line, and so that input needs to be corrected and whatnot. So we now have to repeat this whole process all over again with a series of updates. The problem is, it's going to take another 5 to 7 days to happen. And at that point, we are going to run out of time because payroll is going to be due. So the customer is faced with the question, do I pay my employees late in order to increase my accuracy? Or do I pay them on time but wrong? In other words, some people are going to get the wrong pay. And this is what most companies will choose, given that you don't want to pay a whole group of people late. So now what happens is this pay run is done and we move into the next pay run, but we've got to now deal with the new pay runs process as well as the errors from the previous one. And this is what would happen every month. We would be dealing with, let's say, April's pay run, right? We would be in the month of April doing April's pay run, and we would be backfilling corrections from March, February, and January, every single month. So in May, we would be doing May's payroll and April, March, and February. We always had a trail of 3 months of corrections every single time, which was extremely inefficient, but indicative of the normative experience for cross-border companies. Even though we were dealing with such a small headcount, the cross-border component added this level of complexity, and the level of solution that's available today causes you to require this kind of process. Now, the way that we dealt with errors, right, the customer wanted to look at them or deal with them differently on a per country basis. So what would end up happening is we would have an Excel sheet, one that represented each of the countries, and we would get onto conference calls with screen share and whatnot, and on these conference calls we would have Deloitte Consulting, we would have Blue Black Global, we would have Fingo HR, we would have representatives from the customer, in other words, their internal payroll team. So you've got several people on this call, and we would spend on average 4 to 5 hours per week on a single conference call trying to resolve how we are going to deal with the errors that occurred in this process. And so obviously just a massive waste of time. Now we look at the cost that it takes to have the privilege of this terrible process. I know, because I was running Fingo HR For the simple process of receiving this internal data and putting it into a flexi form for ADP, we were paid $60,000 US a year just for that part of the process. And overall, the total with these four groups totaled $350,000 a year to have a terrible process to pay 541 people in 8 different countries. By comparison, if you were to use CarbonPay software the way that it's designed, which cuts out the need for these extra partners and keeps you simply with a service provider, that in this case would be CarbonPay, with our pricing structure, you would be paying $120,000 a year for a process that is far better, that gets you instant calculations, which means all of this doesn't have to happen. And because the process is distilled down into fairly simple data entry, you can run this with your internal payroll team and not require all of those partners that are typically required to help you manage these processes. A quick note on this particular project: during our time on this project at Fingo HR, we survived 2 sets of internal payroll teams for this customer because the processes were just so bad. And I think the irony is it is indicative of the experience for most companies in this position. And I'd even say there are elements of this process that can be worse for other companies, and we've experienced that as well. But this is really a good example of the normative experience, essentially the case study of what CarbonPay makes better for our customers in terms of time and accuracy and cost, and overall kind of ownership of the process, and so on. So hopefully that's helpful.